come back to the constitutional clarion. Now, one thing I'm often told by people is that they don't really get what the voice is and how it could be helpful. So this is my attempt to explain, at least the way I see it. Okay, so first of all, what is the voice? Well, it would be a committee, a group of people who are largely representative of Indigenous Australians across the length and breadth of the country. It would essentially have three jobs. The first would be to collect evidence from Indigenous communities, large and small, across the nation, about the impact of particular laws and policies on them, what the problems are, and how things could be improved. Second, once it has that information, the job of the voice would be to sort it, to analyse it, and to assess it so it can make sensible and practical suggestions as to how to resolve these problems and to improve outcomes. Third, the voice would then fulfil its constitutional function, which is to make representations to Parliament and the executive government. And these would say what the problem is, show the evidence that supports that problem, and make suggestions for how the problem might be resolved in a practical way. Now, we can't know exactly how the voice is going to operate until it's brought into existence, because this is something that Parliament and the government would have to determine, along with those people who are actually chosen to be on the voice. But just to give you an example, if I were running the show, and heaven knows I'm not, but nonetheless, if I were doing this, how would I construct it and make the voice operate? Okay, so the first thing I would do, step one, would be to create networks for the voice to receive the information that it really needs in order to be able to function. Now, in doing so, I would be trying to establish as wide a range of connections with communities that I possibly could. And so that would involve creating channels of communication with elders in every single Indigenous community across Australia, so the people who have authority to speak for those communities, but also a wide range of bodies that interact with Indigenous people in the community. So that could include everything from land councils and native title representative bodies to bodies that deal with Indigenous health and Indigenous medical services, and all those sorts of things. Any Indigenous-led body that interacts in the community and has actual experience of how laws and policies operate in those communities and where the problems are. So the first task would be setting up those networks so that you're able to get information that gives you a really good picture across the entirety of the country of all the different sorts of problems that arise in everything from cities to the most remote of communities. Now, the second job that I would give the voice would be then to collect that information. And in doing so, what I would do would be to ask each community a number of questions. So the first one would be, okay, tell us 3 small things that cause real problems and irritations in your community that could be easily fixed. Next, I'd ask, well, then tell me 3 big things that have had a bad impact on your lives, and give actual examples of the problems that they cause and ideas for good solutions. Then I'd say, all right, tell us any examples that you can think of about how government money is being wasted and the things that could be done to make spending more effective and better value for money. And then finally, I'd say to them, okay, tell us any ideas that you have for laws and policies that currently don't exist that could improve your lives and do so in a way that doesn't have any kind of significant financial impact on the budget, for example. Now, once all that information was collected, then the third job, and this is the big job for the voice, would be doing the assessment and the analysing of that information. The first thing you'd need to do would be to categorise it and to triage it. Now, by triaging, I mean, well, the voice would have to assess what is urgent, what has high priority, and what is of a lower priority and can be left for a later time. you can imagine that at the very beginning the voice would be deluged with information, so it's going to have to make that kind of assessment. The second one is categorisation, because a lot of the issues that would be raised with the voice would probably actually be issues concerning state and territory matters. So you'd need to sort them out. So here are the things on the Commonwealth side that we can deal with Commonwealth ministers, and here are the state and territory issues which probably need to be dealt with slightly differently. So what could the voice do about state and territory matters? It doesn't really have a mandate in the Constitution expressly to do that, because it's a voice with a function of making representations to the Commonwealth Parliament and to the Commonwealth Executive Government, not to the states. But of course there's nothing that would prevent the voice, along with anyone else for that matter, writing to state ministers or state officials, alerting them to particular problems that fall within their area and suggesting solutions to them. So at the very least, the voice could be used as a clearinghouse to pass on to states and territories the sorts of problems that have been seen and suggest some answers and some solutions to them. For bigger issues, of course, the voice could raise the concern with Commonwealth ministers and officials. It might be, for example, that the Commonwealth minister on a ministerial council could raise the issue with their state counterparts or try to seek a cooperative solution through intergovernmental communications and methods. It might also be that Commonwealth funding of states, particularly programs concerning Indigenous people, could come into play. So there could be particular funding for means of resolving problems, or it could be that conditions would be placed on funding to ensure those kinds of solutions are reached. There's lots of ways involving intergovernmental relations in which the voice could communicate to the Commonwealth and have those concerns passed on to the states and territories and have them dealt with that way. Now, what about Commonwealth matters? Well, first of all, you'd want to look at what are the small things that are easy fixes. You probably want to get some runs on the board at the very beginning. So the first question is, well, how would you deal with it? Would it be, if it's something small and specific, something that you could contact a particular official or a particular agency to deal with rather than having to go through the minister? And that might be a way of dealing with it. But you'd also want to set up some kind of system, I think, and some kind of record so that you know in relation to these things what the voice has done in terms of trying to resolve it, and you can track what the actual results are as well, because as a matter of accountability you would be wanting the voice to be able to report to the public about what it has done and what it's achieved, but also in particular report back to the communities that had gone to the effort of telling them to begin with what the problems were. As for the big issues at the Commonwealth level, again, you'd be asking a number of questions when you categorise them. You'd say, well, how widespread are these issues? Have they turned up in a huge range of communities or just in one or two? Are they narrowly focused or are they broadly representing concerns of Indigenous people across Australia? Now, the next issue for the voice would be, well, what do you do with all this information that you've collected and then assessed? There's no point in the voice just being a big whinge fest. It's got to be able to make recommendations for change or representations that actually are practical and can achieve something. And to do that, you need to be able to convince the government that what you're proposing is a useful thing and in the government's interest to do. So, how do you do that? First, you'd want to identify what is the purpose of the existing law or policy. What is actually driving the government to want it to be there? What is it trying to achieve? And it may be that the government wants to achieve A, B and C. But it may also be that in doing so, it achieves something that you don't want, X, which is the problem that's affecting Indigenous people. So then you'd have to have a think about, well, how could you revise the law or policy so it still does achieve A, B and C, and in fact maybe achieves A, B and C even better, with a better effect or more effectively, but at the same time doesn't have the disadvantageous effect of X. Okay, that's the sort of thing that you'd be looking at to do. Now, the second thing you'd want to look at would be the costs that are involved. could you achieve A, B and C and avoid doing X in a way that would actually cost less and take away less money from the budget? Because if you could do that, you'd be much more likely to convince the government to follow your suggestion. Or could you show that the consequences of X have a flow-on financial effect in a whole lot of other areas that would make it much, much cheaper overall if you did A, B and C in a way that didn't have the outcome of X? Now, third, you want to look at, well, what's the broader impact of these laws and policies on other people as well? If the change that you're proposing would give a benefit to a small number of Indigenous people, while at the same time having a disadvantageous effect on a large number of other people, then you're unlikely to succeed with your proposal. So you'd need to work out how any kind of change would have an impact on everybody else as well and their interests, in order again to propose something that lifts everybody up and gives advantage to everyone, rather than having an effect which would cause the government to say, well, no, we don't support your particular proposal. And the final thing you might want to consider would be, well, is there a way to make the law and policy more adaptable to the circumstances of different communities? And this is a problem that one size does not always fit all. It'd be quite interesting to see what kind of evidence the Voice collected, but my instinct is that it would show that certain communities would want maybe stronger laws in relation to something, while others would be completely opposed to those laws altogether, or policies, as the case may be. So it might well be, for example, that you'd have a base law that would work, equally across everyone, but you could work out ways to give communities options to opt in to laws that had, stricter effects, say, for example, on the use or sale of alcohol in communities. So you could have circumstances where people could opt in to certain laws where it was important in their community, or you could have circumstances where you might allow particular communities to negotiate the kind of laws or rules that would suit their community, so that if they met certain criteria, they could then be given effect by way of some kind of subordinate instrument, so delegated legislation, something of that kind. There might need to be ways where we can just be more flexible so we can achieve good outcomes that are different in different communities to suit the particular needs of those communities. So they're the sorts of things that the Voice would need to consider. So if the Voice wants to achieve change, it needs to be able to convince Parliament or the government that change is in everyone's interest. It advantages everyone. Understanding the purpose and the cost and the impact of the existing laws and proposals to change them, and providing strong evidence to show what the problems are and how the proposed changes might work, is going to be much more effective in getting government to agree to change than just turning up and say, I'm the Voice, give me what I want, which is likely to be very ineffective. So this brings us to the type of representations that the Voice might make in exercising its function under the proposed constitutional amendment. So the sorts of things that it might say are, here's a problem, we've identified what the problem is and that it applies in these communities or these places. Here's evidence of the problem. Here's our assessment as to how you might deal with that problem. And here's our assessment of what kind of impact that might have in terms of financial impact or an impact on both Indigenous people and an impact on everybody else in the community. So that would be the sort of representation you might see, and it might recommend a change to a law or a change to a policy. But there could be other ways of dealing with it as well. The Voice might say, for example, actually here's a problem and here's evidence that it exists, but we don't really have a huge amount of evidence and we're not really sure as to what the solution is. So it might well be that the Voice instead asks the government to fund a study, an academic study on the issue or conduct an inquiry into the issue so that more evidence can be achieved so that you can get a better outcome. So that would be one thing it could recommend. Another thing it might want to recommend is conducting trials. It might be a good idea for the Commonwealth to run a trial to use this kind of policy, this sort of solution in community A, and trial another different sort of solution in community B, and then collect the evidence and see, what's the most effective. And it might well be in doing those trials, you might have community C or D where you say, okay, why don't we have input from that local community and have input into what those kinds of arrangements are, and trial that and see whether it comes up with different solutions and better solutions. So there's a whole lot of sorts of things that the voice could recommend to government, but in the end, it'll be a question of how convincing it is to government. The final point to make is that in the end, it's the government and the parliament that rule. They're the ones who are chosen democratically by all the people across the country, and they're responsible to the people, not the voice. So their decisions in how to respond to representations from the voice very much depend on what they assess to be the effect of any suggested changes and whether this is consistent with the wishes of the voters and meets budget constraints and fits in with other government policies. Improved outcomes for Indigenous Australians will be an important factor, but the government and parliament also need to take into account things that affect other Australians. The existence of the voice does not wipe out the interests and the influence of everyone else. It just supports the ability of Australia's Indigenous peoples to be heard and for Parliament and the government to be better informed when they make their decisions. And being better informed generally is a very good thing. So I hope you have been better informed by this video. I really do hope that it helps. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Goodbye.